I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Jessica Isom, who is a community psychiatrist and a clinical instructor in psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. She did her undergrad at Xavier University in New Orleans, right down the street from where I used to work at the Times-Picayune. And she did her public health and MD at UNC Chapel Hill. I've asked her to come talk in more detail about the criminalization versus medicalization in the treatment of addiction. A couple of the other speakers have touched on this, but I've asked her to come go into a little bit more detail on it and kind of talk about the historical development of this issue. And so that's what she is here for. It's at 12:05. We have her until 1 o'clock Eastern. So she'll present and take questions, and I will turn it over to Dr. Isom.
So I looked at the schedule and saw that you all have spoken with many amazing people. And just as Chris stated, there's lots of overlap between the topics that you've been exposed to in this particular topic. My hope is that there's something new in here for you, and really that it introduces you to a recipe for how, at least this country, but also globally, criminalization and medicalization are applied based on your social group membership. So whenever the face of addiction changes, so do the policies that are enacted, and how we view the use of drugs, how we view those who are vulnerable to addiction has shifted over time as well. And even during the same period, again, based on your social group membership, how you're viewed can change. But at the core, a lot of what we've been contending with over the arc of history is, what is addiction? Is this a psychological inadequacy that some people possess? Is this a cultural deficit that groups possess? Where is the problem? Is it in the addict, or is it in society? What I'd like to impart with you today is that what we do with people who make use of drugs, or who are referred to as those having addictions or substance use disorders, really is driven by social, political, and economic value that we assign to those people and to those groups. Our response can be either humanistic or degrading. It can serve multiple purposes beyond just treating addiction itself. And this distinction between criminalization and medicalization can really offer some useful insights into that area. James Baldwin is one of my favorite people. Anything he's written, you should read. This is a quote I use often in my talks because it's something that addresses one of the dominant cultural characteristics in our country, which is an ahistorical stance when we're talking about topics. He says, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. And if we entered into every conversation owning that and accepting it, we come up with such better definitions of problems. And then from that would come better solutions to those problems. I know people like Dr. Hansen and others have talked about how media portrayals have connected to the types of policies that we offer. They've talked about how race and class factor into the policies that we offer. But really diving deep down into that is what we're going to do today, because race itself, as history has shown us, can connect you to privileges or barriers. And it really results in a number of inequities, including that found within the substance use disorder world. The primary source of that is structural. It's not individual. It's not cultural. And unfortunately, the same stories that we've told in the past are the ones that will repeat today. What we're going to first start with is connecting those social, political, and economic factors to stories of the past, of how crime has been defined and how illness has been defined. And these are stories that are not publicly talked about as much, so hopefully they're new to you. Specifically, though, within those stories is the story of racialization and how criminalization produces racialization of substance use disorders. And I'll end, though, with giving you something that you can use moving forward to make sure that, one, you acknowledge that foundational history, but two, when you talk about the issue, you use a lens that can be really helpful for educating others in your reporting. So what I do not know is if you've been introduced to terminology in your time with other speakers. I like to start off with this terminology and these concepts because it really helps us to be on the same page moving forward. Most people not most people, some people accept at this point that race is a social construct, that it does not have biological validity, that it was created for socio-political and economic purposes, but it's still helpful to review. And what it does is essentially it takes the human race and separates us into categories based on inherited physical characteristics. The interesting thing that you may not hear often is that racism came first. Race is the child of racism and not the father. Racism itself is a system that structures opportunity and assigns value that's based on a phenotype, what we call race, and essentially it offers advantages to some and disadvantages to others. You've also probably heard the term institutional racism, which essentially takes that value assignment and opportunity assignment and applies it to institutions. And within those institutions, including within the institution of medicine, the institution of media, the institution of the criminal justice system, your experiences differ by race. And then personally mediated racism is a part of this story because it makes its way into media reporting. It makes its way into interactions between police officers, for example, and those who are captured and are in possession of drugs. This is when you enact prejudice, which is your assignment of racial groups to certain beliefs about their abilities or motives, and then discrimination, which is behavior that's predicated on your racial group membership. So all of these terms and concepts are swirling throughout the stories that I'll introduce you to today. Another helpful term to understand is exactly what criminalization is. I am not a criminologist, but have had to understand what criminology is in my everyday work as a psychiatrist, because many of my patients interact with the criminal justice system. Crime has multiple meanings. It differs across the world. It really comes down to itself also being a social construct. Every society defines crime in different ways, and definitions of crime change over time. And ultimately, law is shaped by social forces and individuals actually making decisions about what they are going to consider to be a crime. In criminology, the exact definition is it's the process by which behaviors and individuals are transformed into crime and criminals. And in the United States, people who or institutions involved in that include the federal government, but also the states. And what you'll see in drug policy is that over time, things became federal policies that typically had been resting in the hand of the state. And together, they've fused to produce some of the patterns that we see now, such as mass incarceration. Another term to understand is medicalization. What does that mean? It essentially means that we in medicine adopt something that was traditionally considered to be not medical. There's also demedicalization, where things that were once medical are taken away from us as an institution. Things that are inside the medical jurisdiction that we can do, such as, for example, prescribing opiates at one time was actually considered to be a crime, and we were prosecuted for that. And I'll review that in the evolution of drug policy that we'll go over in just a few slides. In the history of addiction, there's just been this constant shifting back and forth between what do we own as medical providers versus what the criminal justice system owns. And that's why there's always a tension between the two. And depending on your social group membership, you may never have the opportunity to be viewed as someone that has a medical condition, as you've seen with the opioid epidemic. Another term that probably is a little bit more novel to you all is this concept of racialization. This is where something that was completely unconnected to racial meaning is reclassified as having a racial meaning. And throughout the story of addiction in the United States, but also globally, you'll see a connection between racial groups and the use of substances. I'm going to prime you with questions that you might ask yourself throughout these stories, because this is the same set of questions that will be really useful moving forward in making sure that you're acknowledging the fact that you live in a country that is foundationally structured around racism and that it manifests itself everywhere. This set of questions comes from a framework of anti-racism by Dr. Kamara Jones, and she essentially gives you questions to deconstruct institutions to see how might racism be operating here. I've used this before with people examining even just policies within the clinic, or examining a specific structure like the operation of a hospital. So you're thinking about decision-making and what comes from that process of decision-making, because inherently any system requires people to have power and influence. So you might ask yourself in these stories, what structures are involved? Who was at the decision-making table? Where did the decision-making happen? You might ask yourself what policies are at play, who's allowed to be there, for example, who or what at the time is considered to be criminal versus not. You might ask what practices and norms are at play. This might be whose voices are included in discussions about what makes something criminal or not. And then there's also values at play. What about who we value or don't value determines the entire process of making a decision in the first place. So now that we've gone through that foundational terminology, we can look at this description of the evolution of addiction treatment that really shows how medicalization itself was supported by, in specific demographics, science. Medicalization was the norm for a good period of time, while many people in the 18th century, 19th century were making use of opium and cocaine. It was unregulated, accessible to many people. And over time, a number of different factors contributed to the regulation of it. And we'll go over pieces of that story today. When we talk about addiction treatment, us in the medical field, we often start with where we step into the story, which is where we were affected by the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, because in this Harrison Narcotic Act, the medicalization of use of opioids specifically was demedicalized. It was taken away from us. We'd been treating people who had problems with heroin, with morphine, and this particular act was used to prosecute us for doing something that previously had not been considered criminal. So that's our story. It starts there, but I'll open up the story to more groups in just a moment. You'll also see in this graph just the development of many forms of medications for specific disorders, such as disulfiram for alcohol use, the opioid treatment programs initially with methadone, over time, more treatments for alcohol use disorder like naltrexone and acamprosate, and then finally, more recently, buprenorphine for opioid use disorder. When I talk about criminalization, the most important thing to understand is that it produces racialization of types of substance use. And I don't think this is something that many people talk about, which is the three groups that were actually directly contributing to the creation of the Harrison Narcotics Act. And that was Chinese Americans, Black Americans, and then later in different ways at the state level, Mexican Americans. History itself demonstrates that there is a direct line between how we criminalize addiction and then how that results in a racialization of substance use. And one of the first drug laws in our country was actually passed in San Francisco to deal with the problem of Chinese persons in that part of the United States. Historically, Chinese people had served a purpose for our country. They had filled gaps in the labor force that were pretty glaring. And once that particular use was fulfilled, a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment grew. And one of the ways to deal with a problem with a group, or at least a racial group that's considered to be a problem, is to leverage their relationship with a particular substance. There's a whole lot of history between the United States and China as it relates to trade of opium, which we're not going to go into, but I'll say briefly that the United States has had a very long relationship with China in the form of bringing opium into the country, but also bringing opium around the world, including to the Philippines, for example, specifically nourishing the use of opium by Chinese people globally. Specifically here in our country, that was a relationship that they were very much used to and familiar with. However, what bothered the officials at the time was that other people were making use of opium as well, including white people. So what they created was this story that the use of opium by Chinese persons in opium dens was causing problem for society, including the people most valued in society, which are white people, specifically white women. So that early opium legislation was actually used to solve a few problems. It allowed them to criminalize and actually harass Chinese persons who were participating in opium dens, and it provided some kind of leverage for reducing quote unquote race mixing. And that is illustrated in some of the plays that actually were produced based on this story. If you look at the image on the right, you can see there are white people in the image, white men and women. There's also Chinese people depicted as well. And then you have a police officer coming through the window. And it's just showing how together they were participating in use of the substance, but the people who were demonized were those considered Chinese. And law was essentially used to disrupt that process. The interesting thing about this story, which is the same part of all of these stories, is that in order to leverage law, in order to be for it to be culturally normative to harass and denigrate a population, it requires that you assign characteristics to that population that are unfavorable. So what that means is that language such as smugglers, gamblers, prostitutes, and things of that nature were ascribed to Chinese people, and they were also considered to be morally bankrupting of white people. So I just put a couple of images here on the slide to show how that language was articulated in various sources, including that they're an impending evil that's traveling to our country and will damage us for generations to come, specifically destroying the white population. And then at the bottom, they even brought children into the mix, saying that these opium dens were essentially corrupting innocent victims, specifically innocent white children. And if there's not something done about this issue, it'll lead to the demise of our entire population. Same story repeats itself around the same time, actually, the late 19th century and early 20th century, this time with cocaine. This is specifically in the Jim Crow era in the South. Black people, among other people, were making use of cocaine, and it bothered Jim Crow whites enough that they actually leveraged the same story, this association between a denigrated racial group and criminality, to make a case for supporting actually the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. The same thread was an association between a substance, cocaine, and its use by a racial group and what it could produce for the good people in society. So that was, again, specifically referenced in one very popular quote that the cocaine is often the direct incentive to the crime of rape by Negroes of the South. So tying, again, this racial fear of Black men to the purity of white women, and that drives this moral panic, which produces legislation. The other thing that this racialization produced is a license to harass Black people in the Jim Crow South. So anyone who was suspected of making use of cocaine could be lynched at the most extremes, but at the very minimum could be penalized criminally in some way. The third group affected by this around, again, the same time were Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants specifically. After the Mexican Revolution of 1910, a large number of Mexican immigrants traveled into the United States territory, specifically in the Southwest, and they brought with them their practice of making use of marijuana. And the racist fears of the group of Mexican immigrants was displaced onto the substance itself. So they both became connected to this negative regard, again, fueled by racism. And then you saw the discussions about marijuana changing. So marijuana became, they became described as the marijuana menace. They were tied to use of marijuana, specifically inciting very violent crimes. They were described as smoking marijuana and having a lust for blood, for example, or having superhuman strength that they used to commit crimes. And there was also this story about their weed, specifically being a killer weed that would be used by unsuspecting American school children, which again is specifically talking about white children. So this was all fueling anti-drug campaigns that led to the criminalization of marijuana use. At least back then, things have changed over time. Again, using the same story of having a quote unquote inferior racial group being ascribed characteristics that are, typically considered to be socially deviant, and that fueling this interest in using legislation to address that racial group. And specifically, this one illustrates how states themselves were responsive beyond federal legislation, because a lot of pseudoscience was done actually connecting marijuana and its use to things such as crimes and violence and other deviant behavior, so much so that states took it upon themselves to actually themselves outlaw marijuana based on these narratives. So one term that describes all of this, sort of this overreaction to what really are unfounded relationships between a racial group and use of a substance, or some kind of social group, could be those who are considered lower socioeconomic status, and a substance is a moral panic, and it's a very effective strategy. And the same strategy was used in the war on drugs, which is a story I'm sure we're all familiar with, for the most part, hopefully at this point. And I want to make the point here that a lot of times we'll reference racism as something that manifests itself unintentionally. However, there's clearly, from the stories I've just shared, a lot of intentionality around the connection of racial groups to negative characteristics and behaviors. This quote from the War on Drugs is very popular for illustrating that point. It just basically, John Ehrlichman was one of Nixon's top aides, and he's here explicitly characterizing why they did what they did during the War on Drugs, essentially connecting the labeling of these populations with socially deviant characteristics to the criminalization of substances that they were associated with, which allowed them to disrupt those communities and really do what they wanted to do. So this idea of racial innocence, where things just happen and by chance have racist impacts, is not necessarily true, specifically in the context of thinking about drug policy. One of the really—
Dr. Isom, I was wondering if I could ask a quick question on that Earl Coming quote. Do you know when he said that? And I mean, like, how long after the administration, or?
I can go and check, because I'm not sure.
Oh, and don't worry about it. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's a good question. Was it on his deathbed, or was it like 2 years later?
Yeah.
I don't know. But what I wanted to share with you is a resource that I love, which is the Drug Policy Alliance. They have a really great video that in 3.5 minutes describes the war on drugs. It's something that you could watch a million times and also share it with people that don't understand the connection between criminalization and racialization. And I'll play that for you now, just to get us to the point where we can now talk about some of the consequences from the war on drugs. Okay.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters, the sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the US blew up. Today we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis. but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated 50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared the so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
So I just want to take a few minutes to dive into some of those statistics, just represented in a different way. And I want to also humanize the numbers. So when we're talking about criminalization, we're talking about people who, yes, maybe received some short stints in jail, but there are many people who are actually in prisons or in jails for longer periods of time who are disconnected from their families and loved ones as a result of just possessing drugs on their person. So as we're thinking about the stories, the statistics, the thing I appreciate about that image is that it showed actual people that were impacted, and I encourage you to think the same. I practice in a majority Black community, serving people who have themselves experienced disconnection from their family and loved ones by spending time in jail and prison related to substance use that in other areas would never have impacted and shaped their lives in the same way. So these images are pulled from the Prison Policy Initiative, and it basically illustrates exactly what the issue is when we say mass incarceration. So this first image shows that there are a lot of people in prisons and jails and other places. And these are people who, many of whom have substance use disorders. And one of the things I will say about being incarcerated is that most of the people there are people that I touch, people who have mental illness or substance use disorders. However, even though they're in a place where they sometimes have relatively more access to substance use treatment, even their experiences within these settings can be racialized as well, and also can be quite punitive. Some places are great, some places are terrible. Also, something else to think about is the fact that using funds to support the substance use needs of incarcerated persons takes away funds that could be used for the community and public resources that might prevent them even entering into the criminal system in the criminal justice system in the first place, specifically if they weren't criminalized for things that could be considered illnesses or disorders. The second image is just showing that people in jails are not necessarily always convicted of crimes. So there's a proportion of people who are here for drug possession specifically, who are literally just sitting there waiting for something to happen to them. And for drug offenses at the federal level, they represent a pretty significant portion of what they do, what they serve, how they service the needs of the population. And the question might be is if we shifted both federal and state and local attention away from dealing with drug possession, how could that open up these resources for doing other things that may be more relevant to their function as an institution? This next image just shows that 1 in 5 people are locked up for a drug offense. So they represent a pretty big chunk of what goes through these different facilities. And if you think about the contrast between possession and actual sale, most of the people that are in these places have possessed some amount of a substance. There's a big complicated conversation around how much is for personal use versus how much is for intent to distribute, which we're not going to get into. But the point is that the majority of these people are here because they possess an amount of a drug that has been criminalized. As far as the demographics of these people, they are, this here is just illustrating that the population is majority white, that illicit drug use is pretty much the same no matter what group you're in. But that your arrest for drug possession is racialized as well. So there's an overrepresentation of Black and Latino persons who are actually arrested for drug possession. The interesting thing to think about too is that things vary by state. And I'll talk a little bit about one state at the end who's did something really cool recently. In some places, they're changing laws to address the consequences of the war on drugs, such as New York. Other places, they're continuing strong in support of that kind of criminalization. And you can see that drug offenders are still a pretty big chunk, for example, in South Dakota, of their prison population. It's also important to think about, again, how has this changed the demographics of who's there? That data I showed you specific to Massachusetts, earlier specific to the entire population, is illustrated here just for my state, Massachusetts, where I practice. And what does it mean that, again, we have so many people over the past few decades ending up incarcerated? What does that mean for their communities? What does that mean for the other things that we think about related to health, such as their economic position, their ability to climb upward as far as their social mobility, their ability to sustain themselves throughout, their family's ability to sustain themselves throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, their ability to sustain themselves inside of an institution that has not been offering them the protection that they need. And all of this is significantly rooted in a criminalization of drug use. So I asked you before, to consider questions in these stories to get a sense of, okay, how in looking at a story can I deconstruct what aspects of this might be rooted in racism? We talked about structures, we talked about policies, we talked about practices and norms, and we also talked about values. And one thing that I would encourage you to consider is that there is no story that doesn't have these questions asked first, because often our approach to talking about these issues is colorblind or averse to discussing how race and racism plays a role. So one thing that can be really useful in any conversation around this specific topic, but really any topic, is to apply a racial equity lens. It really is a pair of glasses that allows you to see the world in a completely different way than the way that you've been trained to see it. So a racial equity lens supports you in viewing and illuminating and appreciating racial dynamics that contribute to how we socially, economically, and politically shape the issues that we are contending with. It's a lens that can be used with other ones, such as gender lenses, class lenses, et cetera. It can help you essentially clarify for yourself what exactly do we need to deploy as far as strategies and resources to address this problem. It can support you in really thinking about what can be done to change the equation, which for a lot of people might be, just for this first part, analyzing data and information about race and ethnicity, which a lot of people don't do. Again, they have a really colorblind approach. Another really cool thing about it is that it forces you to think about systems and structures, not just individual attitudes and behaviors. So you get to the root cause of why you see disparities and inequities. And lastly, it allows you to name race explicitly when you're talking about both the problem and also the solution. And you've seen that illustrated, at least more recently, in conversations about the opioid epidemic. I just want to leave you with an idea to consider that some people are talking about, but is not being talked about enough, because this is one solution that's been proposed to addressing this issue of how criminalization has produced a racialization of substance use, and also how that relates to mass incarceration. Before you watch this, I want to give you a sense that it is possible. So I will say there's already a state, and that state is Oregon, who in November actually approved a measure that went into effect this year in February, where they no longer are criminalizing people with arresting people and putting them in jail for having possession of small amounts of drugs. That includes heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. So in Oregon, that has happened. This video is just a very quick 1-minute discussion of what decriminalization is. And then I'll briefly go over what the benefits might be, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A.
Today on DPA's Matters of Substance, what is all drug decriminalization and why should it happen? Each year, there are over 1.6 million drug arrests in the United States, over 85% of them for possession only. Drug decriminalization removes criminal penalties for possession of any drug for personal use. Decriminalization frees up law enforcement resources. It saves money, since fewer people will be arrested or in jails and prisons for drug possession. Decriminalization encourages people to come out of the shadows and seek treatment and other support. It puts the health and safety of drug users first. Portugal decriminalized possession of all drugs in 2001. Drug use rates have stayed about the same, but disease and overdose rates have plummeted, while drug treatment rates have increased. It's time we do the same. The Drug Policy Alliance is working towards all drug decriminalization.
And they are very pleased with the progress that was made in Oregon. So some of the things that we talked about could potentially be addressed by decriminalization, including over-policing of communities of color. They're there because they will find what everyone would find in any community, which is use of drugs. It might also address the stigma problem and drive us to coming up with better solutions for addiction, but also encouraging people to seek treatment for their use. This idea of retroactively expunging records or reducing sentences is just an amazing possible benefit, because there are so many people, again, whose lives have been impacted because of their racial group membership and how criminalization shapes their experiences of their relationship with drugs. And then lastly, there's conversations in this world about how deportation for even just a small amount of drug possession is problematic, and how decriminalization could address that as well. So I will end there and just ask that you use this information to better understand for yourself the connection, but also use it to intervene in whatever way you can, specifically in your reporting, in ways that might recruit others to the fight for supporting whatever policy they feel makes sense, including decriminalization if they're a fan of that. So thank you.
Okay, so plenty of time for questions, and Christine is first.
Hi, thank you, Doctor. I'm based in Illinois. I'm at Illinois Public Media and NPR station in Champaign-Urbana. My question is about drug courts, and I just want to hear your thoughts on like these types of diversion programs. I've heard, and I understand there are different ways to doing them, pre-sentencing versus post-sentencing. I know that, here in Champaign County, the drug court, the way it operates is people get a sentence and then the option of doing drug court. And then if they fail at treatment, they get put in jail. And they might have different ways of navigating that, because relapse is a part of having a substance use disorder. So it's not just one failure. But your thoughts on all of that, because for some people, like you pointed out, the first time they get access to treatment or an opportunity to get treatment is after they've been arrested and sentenced for a drug crime.
Yeah. So one, referrals to those sorts of programs is racialized. So the opportunity to go to a drug court or diversion program, of course, inherently involves racial bias on who gets selected to go versus not. So that's one point. The other point too is, and people have different feelings about this, is like, what is the goal of your relationship with the substance? And in a very liberatory way, the idea that drug courts are asking for complete abstinence in and of itself would be problematic if that was your starting point, because some people would argue that what you're trying to address is how your relationship with the drug might have a negative impact on your life, but does that necessarily require abstinence or not? So that's one point. And then the other would be that drug courts preventing people from being placed into jails and prisons is helpful, but do they address the other factors that drive their relationship with the substance in the first place, whether it be for pleasure, which is absolutely okay. There are people across the globe who make use of drugs for pleasure, but then there are other reasons, such as those social determinants of health. Are they helping these people get employed? Are they addressing their experiences of poverty? Are they helping them to navigate racism and how that shapes your relationship with drugs? So it's sort of diverting them from, yes, the criminalization aspect and how toxic that can be, but the expectations for changing their relationship with drugs can sometimes be viewed as too stringent, and also their expectations are not being supported by offering a comprehensive group of programming and societal changes that would really help people change their relationships with substances who need to. I don't have any relationship with drug court to accept when people are forced to come see me, not necessarily just for substances, but for other court mandated reasons. And I can't say that my approach is any different, except for the pressure that if they can't become abstinent, what consequences that might have for their life. And that doesn't feel very good or patient-centered. I'll just put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have got 7 people in line here, and we have 15 minutes. So try to aim for the 1 to 2 minute answer so we can get all the questions in. But we'll go Danielle, Barbara, Kyle, Stephen, Cheryl, Alexis, and Georgia. Danielle first.
Hi, doctor. My name is Danielle Harrison. I work for an Indigenous publication in Oregon, and I've done a couple of stories since Oregon decriminalized drug possession. And the one thing I've noticed is that when I've talked to law enforcement and clinicians, and these are people of different racial backgrounds and different experiences, the one thing that they've all said is that they're generally not in favor of decriminalizing drug possession because they say it increases other criminal behaviors. I've heard domestic violence, encouraging underage use, that type of thing. What are your thoughts on this, and why do you think most are very resistant to it?
Yeah. So one, I mean, people are resistant to anything different from the status quo. So often are hypercritical of any suggested change. That's usually the starting point. 2, law enforcement officers and clinicians, we have a very biased people who make use of drugs. I mean, we see people who are either ending up in the criminal justice system because of their relationship or ending up in treatment. We're not often seeing the full picture of the diversity of different kinds of relationships with a substance. So we have a skewed perspective. I am not an expert on the relationship between use of drugs and criminality. And I hesitate to say, I don't want to say there's not a relationship, but I do feel it can be over exaggerated. And we're sort of narrowly connecting criminality to one thing. If drugs were decriminalized and we use that funding to support other drivers of criminality, such as poverty, addressing experiences of discrimination and marginalization, then who's to say that their predictions would come true? So I appreciate the Drug Policy Alliance and how it breaks down opportunities for other things in addition to decriminalization, or as a result of decriminalization, that might support people engaging in less crime. I don't think just focusing on the addiction piece just doesn't seem comprehensive enough, and seems a little bit like a cop-out because it, again, prevents us from talking about all the other things that we neglect to change that drive criminality. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, next up, Barbara.
There, Doctor. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement has definitely shown the spotlight on the racial inequalities. And I'd like to think we are seeing more reporting, thankfully, of an accurate breakdown of what's going on in our prisons and in the healthcare situation. But how can we, as reporters, I'd like to go beyond that. I report until I turn blue in the face. But what can we do, maybe forge change? I know in Rhode Island, and I'm in Rhode Island, the MDC nation, so we're neighboring states, we do have decriminalized small amounts of marijuana, but really no other drugs. I mean, what do we do? How do we report? How do we forge change as journalists, or do we just do what we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, the lawmakers often look to, go ahead. The lawmakers often, their opinions on policy issues are shaped by their exposures to the media. So one thing I would ask is there a coordinated effort among all aspects of the institution of the media to commit themselves to something around this issue? Because if there was a cohesive effort that tied together the bigger, people like CNN and MSNBC, but also local news channels and newspapers and everything else to driving a specific narrative that was more anti-racist in nature or anti-oppression, then that would actually shape the policies that lawmakers were interested in, because you all are a large source of their information. So maybe, and I'm ignorant to what you all are doing, but maybe some organizing within journalist worlds around committing to reporting that is what I described could be a place to start that could have impacts for years to come. And I don't know, I would love to talk about what there is in the journalist world as far as a commitment to that effort, because I have no idea.
We do have organizations, like I'm a member of the Southern New England Association of Black Journalists and also of NAJ. I think Cheryl said she's very involved as well. So we do have organizations like that. And I think we can probably start there. There are also other podcast and print organizations, and maybe that's where we start is within our organizations.
Yeah, you all have a lot of power as an institution in lots of different ways to shape perspectives and even feelings about issues. So inside your own house, I think would be a place to start.
Okay, up next, Kyle.
Hi, Doctor. Thanks for making the time. Couple things struck me as you were going through there. You mentioned the decriminalization in Oregon, but you also mentioned, or the video also highlighted the discrimination that's seen in ticketing where, marijuana has been decriminalized. So I'm curious, what do you think decriminalization is simply a less bad system than our current system? I'm curious on a much more 10,000 foot view, if it's your view that prohibition is ever correct. And if we do take that view, the question of regulation of any sort, i.e. a minimum age sort of thing, just big picture, is prohibition ever the right answer?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can answer the whole question. I mean, I'll take a piece of it and say criminalization is like a license to interact with vulnerable communities more than you would if it didn't exist. So the fact that marijuana itself has been criminalized, for example, can lead people to being pulled over, stopped, frisked, searched, their homes searched, all of these sorts of things that are a part of that license. So in a very narrow sense, decriminalization removes one aspect of how law enforcement can intrude on communities because they are vulnerable, meaning selectively policed. And then these policies support doing whatever you can to address their criminality, which is really just possessing of drugs. The prohibition question is pretty big. I mean, there's globally different ways of approaching that issue. It's changed over time for a number of different reasons. And the main focus for my interest in it, decriminalization specifically, is what kind of impact it could have on all of the consequences of those racialized drug policies. The larger question of prohibition would be something I'd have to have a conversation with you about over coffee.
When it comes to decry, I'd love to take you up on that post-pandemic. When it comes to what we've seen with decriminalization, again, referencing that video suggesting that affluent college kids up at Columbia aren't getting ticketed quite like they are elsewhere in the city. Do you see that as just racism being endemic to every single system we have, and thus not as much about the criminalization there, or is it less bad in that it's not as extreme a regime?
Yeah, so the video is talking about selective policing. So it's connected to that data on drug use being similar across racial ethnic groups, but there being a disproportionate sort of attention focused on specific communities and their relationship with drugs. And then because there's a criminalization of drug use, they are suffering more consequences. If Columbia College was actually policed for its drug use, then you would see, and if every step was not rooted in like a racial lens, then you should see the same number of Columbia College students being arrested and put into jails and prisons as people down the street in Harlem. So what they're saying there is that the law is not equally applied, and then policing itself is selectively applied, which is why criminalization produces racialization. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's not that Columbia has decriminalized use on that college campus. It's just protected from the kind of policing that you would find in like Black and Latino neighborhoods.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. I guess my question is, even with decriminalization, we are seeing a targeting of minority populations, even though it might be a $50 ticket as opposed to a day.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so how would we address the rest of it? Then we'd have to address why, knowing that disparity exists, that those enforcement agencies are not being held accountable. I mean, it would sort of be like decriminalization does not solve the structural racism problem for law enforcement agencies. No.
Okay.
So yeah, the culture of the organization and how it's practice, its practices and norms and values are all still there. So whatever tool is there can be applied in a discriminatory way. At least in this case, you're right, relatively it's better, maybe, because they're not going to jail or prison, but financially, it's sort of like the poverty tax in the same way that there is disproportionate ticketing for like minor traffic violations. There are still consequences from that as well that should be addressed. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's try to, we still have 4 questions. Let's try to keep these in. So if the fellows could keep it to like one question, and we can try to get all 4 in. We have Stephen, then Cheryl, then Alexis, and just 3 to go. So go to Stephen first.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us today. My question was really about addiction treatment. I'm curious, what role do you think racism has played in terms of how we've shaped the addiction treatment field in this country? And are there concerns that, looking ahead, that the next crisis, drug crisis that we have, or drug epidemic that we have in this country, if it is not, if it is started, by in another group, not in white, that we might fall back into the same old patterns that we saw like maybe 30 years ago, where there was less emphasis on mainstream medical institutions focusing on evidence-based treatment and more marginalized treatments, more, mom and pop shop recovery centers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot there, and I can send you some papers, but that every institution is structured to primarily serve the needs of the majority group, which in this country are white people of a certain class. So even once you enter into treatment, the treatment itself is inadequate. It's not culturally sensitive. It's not culturally responsive. It leads to poor engagement in services at all, and then very poor retention once you're in services. So that's still the problem that we didn't discuss today. And yes, I mean, we're a country that, again, is very ahistorical. If this happened again, maybe there's a chance that there would be a different response, but our natural tendency, again, is to humanize some groups and not others. So it would take considerable effort from a number of different institutions to ensure that did not happen, including the media, but also medicine and other places. But yeah, I can send you some papers in more detail because I do a lot of work on anti-racism and addiction treatment that we could talk about offline.
Okay, Cheryl.
Yes, and I see we don't have much time. I'm Cheryl Smith from Texas Metro News. And I wanted you to address, because it seems like more of the blue states are the ones that are doing really great things toward moving toward decriminalizing the epidemic. And I know I can't get into my questions in 1 minute, so I'd just like to take you up on that coffee too. It's just I'm drinking a gallon of water a day instead, okay? So I do want to connect with you. And I have 2 Xavier fellows here, and I know they'd say you making them proud. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Alexis, last question.
Hi, thank you so much for a great presentation. I feel like I've learned so much about the science of addiction and the history and the racialization of drug policy in the US, but only as an adult. And I'm wishing, and these are things that I learned when I was younger, in conjunction with, like the DARE program I went through. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can, start that kind of education process younger and help younger people understand the real science of addiction and the racialization of these drug policies that have been put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on where you grew up, like your own positionality, you understand it more if you've been impacted by it more. For people that are completely ignorant to it, I don't even know where the conversation could happen. I've done a school program where I got a chance to come in and talk about drugs. I got a chance to come in and talk about drugs to middle school students and high school students, specifically around really encouraging them not to use it. We did not get a chance to talk about the things that I'm talking about today. And I don't know, maybe we would get invited depending on the school. I'm an adult psychiatrist though, and my child's only 3, so I haven't interfaced with the schools more recently. And a part of me is just wondering, based on my own childhood, what space could there even be to have these kinds of conversations when the curriculums themselves are often extremely toxic to real history accounting and talking about real issues. So that was a very pessimistic answer, and I apologize. It would have to be something outside of a school, maybe like some kind of online thing that people could opt into that could be very honest about this history and its present day consequences.
Okay, and on that note of pessimism, we need to end this session. Dr. Isom, I want to thank you very much for a fascinating talk.